Welcome to the MA English students at the Indira Gandhi National Open University. In your course in English, you would have heard of all the new literatures in English. And we are now aware, of course, that the horizons of English have expanded to many countries beyond England. New writing from several countries has now come into prominence, and within this scope, writers from Canada have made eminent name for themselves in the literary world. Today we will be focusing on Canadian literature, and in the studio this afternoon I have here Professor Uma Parmeswaran from the University of Winnipeg. Professor Parmeswaran is an eminent writer and critic. She was credited with inventing and reusing a term, Trishanku, which dealt with the problem of the immigrant writer, and subsequently Professor Parmeswaran has done considerable work in post-colonial writing and in women's studies. Welcome, Uma, and I look forward to a discussion today with Dr. Parmeswaran on several significant aspects of Canadian literature.
Thank you. I am really delighted to be here today, and I'm sure we will cover some important aspects of both the Canadian and the South Asian Canadian component, hopefully.
I thought we might put forward a possible scope for our discussion. This will be in two parts. The first part, we could perhaps talk in terms of significant aspects of Canadian literature, and then we will come to a definite focus on Margaret Lawrence's novel The Stone Angel, which is a prescribed text. From that, perhaps we could go on to the second part, which will have a focus on South Asian Canadian writing and look at the interaction that now exists in the multicultural, multi-ethnic world of Canadian writing. Would that be all right?
That would be good.
Would you say that one of those changes has been the emphasis on postmodernism, which as a literary style has come to be associated as a very major feature of Canadian writing? I have in mind, for instance, Robert Croce's many essays on the subject, and also Linda Hutchins' book, The Canadian Postmodern.
That's true, because up to a certain point, there was more emphasis placed on regionalism. And then we come into the postmodernist phase, where it wasn't regionalism so much as this fragmentation of identity that started being talked about, both in literature and in life, isn't it?
Why do you think there has been so much interest in celebrating the fragmentation of identity in Canada?
I think it goes to the other postmodernist impulse, which is individualism, that we are all different. And so rather than looking for the commonalities to affirm the differences, would you say that that is one of the foci of postmodernism?
Yes, I would certainly agree with you that looking at what Bharti Mukherjee, for instance, calls the fluid identity. Right. The other thing that brings writing from Canada and India on some kind of a common ground is post-colonialism, since both the countries had a link with the imperial rule of England. In that context, perhaps postmodernism and post-colonialism get to be common concerns for writers in Canada as well as in India. But what would you say about a writer such as Margaret Lawrence, who would fit into a certain kind of writing in Canada at a certain given time, and very closely linked with the Anglo-Saxon tradition of Canadian literature rather than the marginal writing in the same country?
That's right. Margaret Lawrence came at a time when people were getting very conscious of their connections to England and a kind of breaking away from those connections to England. Whereas what we now have is or let me put it another way, the difference between Canada and India is that, isn't it? That up to a certain point, it was the French and English presence in Canada and the settler mentality and the experience that counted there. And it was a new land, and everything was new. Whereas with India, it was an old land with an old culture, and the British came and had their influence on what was happening. Would you say, isn't that the difference between a new land and an old land?
Yes, I would agree with you very much that while talking about post-colonialism, we have to keep this key factor in mind, that there is a difference between colonized nations and settler nations. Again, in the context of Margaret Lawrence, there is a lot of reference to the Scots coming into Canada. Would you tell us a little more about this?
Exactly. Margaret Lawrence sets all her novels in my province of Manitoba, incidentally. She was born in Manitoba, and she lived in a small place called Neepawa, that is about 150 miles from Winnipeg, where I live. And in her novels, she talks about the small community where the majority of people were settlers from Scotland. And this, in about the third quarter of the 19th century, this was called the Red River Settlement in Winnipeg and around Winnipeg in Manitoba. And most of those who came first to this, this piece of land were the Scottish people, the British. And a little later came the Ukrainians, and we have them too in her novels, as we know, not in The Stone Angel, but certainly in A Jest of God. The divide between the white Anglo-Saxon Protestants and the Ukrainians is very much there.
When Margaret Lawrence is talking about the Scottish influence in her life, and then she fictionalizes on this basis in the novel, she allocates the idea of a strong sense of duty on one hand to the Scots people, but equally important is the attitude of what she calls dare.
Yes.
In her heritage. Would you say that the novel looks into the idea of daring, risk-taking, adventure-taking and strength in a woman protagonist?
Oh, now you're coming to the women protagonist. Let's take the common psyche between men and women of the Scottish heritage. That is there, the puritanical, Calvinistic influences of the early settlers, and that is there in her male and female figures. And Hagar Shipley is a descendant of that from both sides. And what she strives to do is perhaps imitate her father, the father figure. Is that not what happens?
Yes, indeed. She seems to admire her father's strength, and she does not want to be associated with a kind of feminine weakness that she associates with her mother. I would definitely agree with you on that ground. But I'm also looking at what happens to this kind of a Scots mentality when it is transferred from its setting in Scotland to a new country like Canada. What would be the nature of that relationship, the contact with the new world, with nature? Margaret Atwood has a lot to say about that in Survival, where she mentions that one of the dominant features of Canadian literature is the notion of victim possession, the notion of survival, and the vital contact that exists in Canada between human beings and nature. What aspect of this transfers to Margaret Lawrence's novel, The Stone Angel?
Margaret Atwood titles one of her chapters Ice Mothers, you remember, and Hagar Shipley in The Stone Angel is that. She is an ice figure all the way through, but that is what she wants to be, because, as you say, this idea of daring, of putting herself in that position where she will not show weakness. So that's what she has grown up with, And that is the temperament that she wants to cultivate in herself. And it takes her 90 years to realize that maybe that attitude is not quite right.
It's an amazing novel. While reading it, I was struck by the realization that there are hardly any novels in English that have such an elderly protagonist. And though she is writing about her life, in a way she's doing with lucidity and the interaction of memory with her present experiences. What would you have to say about the treatment of the aged protagonist in this novel?
Yes, I think the novel moves on two levels. One is, it is the story of one woman, and mainly it is her sense of pride and how she does not want to go into the long night. You remember that?
Yes,
that's a part of the prefix that we have there. Do not go gentle into the good night. Dylan Thomas's. So that is one part of her of the novel. The other part is that Margaret Laurence beautifully depicts 90 years of the settler's history through the 90 years of Hagar's life, and the both the environment which was there when she was born and which is there when she dies. So in a way it is historical at the collective level as well as historical at the personal level. Now you started talking about the personal level and of Hagar's age, and it's a beautifully rendered novel, especially considering it was her first.
Yes, indeed.
Margaret Laurence starts with the old woman, and then her protagonists get younger. So it is, and that is why I feel that the collective image is perhaps what inspired Margaret Laurence to write the strong women that she saw around her, but also how if you are not strong, you really get totally torpedoed by the patriarchal kind of system in which they were forced to survive.
I think you've raised a very interesting and a very useful issue. One, that of the ice mother, and second, the nature of strength in a woman and what it does as a consequence within a patriarchal community. Let's take a look at the title, which has been much debated by critics, The Stone Angel. And of course we remember that famous opening paragraph where Hagar is thinking of the stone angel that her father constructed or had placed in memory of Hagar's dead mother. And there is a lot of irony in that opening paragraph which reflects upon the use of the title. Now the stone angel has been differently identified with Hagar, with a kind of symbolic blindness, with a kind of egotistical pride, and personally I'm not sure whether one interpretation is to be privileged over another. I would be interested in your explication of the title of that novel.
I think Margaret Laurence, her loyalties were ambivalent, because she does greatly respect and admire the steel, spine, the unbending and sort of strength of Hagar. But she also sees that finally it is because Hagar could not let go of that pride, of that the backbone, that she might have missed out a great deal on the emotional aspects of life. Isn't that so? And that is why that scene where she reconciles to her son, because whom she had always thought weak and therefore not to be loved, that is a beautiful scene.
Yes, that is a very beautiful scene towards the end of the novel. Can we take a look at a very significant climactic section in about the middle of the book, the chapters that deal with Hagar at Shadow Point? We of course remember the circumstances in which she arrives at this Hades-like place. she is left home because she suspects that her other son and daughter-in-law are going to send her off to an old people's home. So Hagar runs away from home, rides a bus, and then finds her way down several steps into a fish cannery. And by herself, she comes to understand many things that have been going on in her inner psychology. She is there without the usual support systems of civilization. There is no food, no water, no modern conveniences, and she is there entirely by herself, confronted with raw nature. Do you think that Shadow Point has something to say about the Canadian individual's connection with society in a larger way?
You've put it very well, because that is a very significant point in the novel. And there again, there are two things happening. One is the archetypal search, the quest motif, and the archetypal journey that one must take away from society in order to find oneself, which is what she does. But at the collective level, there is that point too, which where that scene sort of talks about the return to community that is necessary, that you have to come back to your people with a better understanding of yourself so that they can open themselves to you. So at the collective level, there is that. And the third point, if I might say, is the connection between nature and human beings. And in that scene, I think what we find is that all along she has felt that in order to be strong, one has to imitate not only the Scottish sort of ancestry, but also nature. And nature in Manitoba can be very, very harsh, very cold and very bitter winters. And therefore, if you are not strong, you're likely to bend over and, collapse. So that is one. But in that moment, I think she brings that nature, the softer aspects of nature. Would you say the birds, trees?
Yes.
Not the snow and the harsh blizzard landscape, but the softer aspects of nature. So do you see that connection there, that it both talks about the harshness of the prairie winter, but also a reaffirmation that unless we have that link with nature, the softer aspects of nature, we do not realize our deepest human potential?
Yes, I think that's very well put, and indeed seems to me a repetitive pattern in Canadian literature, this link between human beings, the inner life, and nature, and the discovery of that connection through some kind of a traumatic episode, which makes one turn inwards and reflect upon oneself. In which context could we perhaps talk in terms of literary influences on Margaret Laurence, in the sense that there was a great deal happening in Anglo-Saxon writing at this time. The issue of nature and human beings was one. The issue of language was another. Do you see Margaret Laurence being experimental in the language that she is using in this novel?
She certainly does use a lot of stream of consciousness, in that we get into the inner workings of Hagar's mind. What else now? I'm thinking of her dialogues, mind you. That too, the characterization of many of those conversations is excellent. The characterization aspect, in that you see that. But you are thinking more perhaps of experimentation the way we have it in what we're going to talk about next, which is the South Asian Canadian element, where we are introducing a new language in order to expand that. Is that what you have in mind?
Yes, I have that in mind too, plus a sort of postmodern play with language, if I may put it that way. For instance, the book ends at a point when there is a nurse holding out a glass of water to a dying Hagar, and Hagar angrily pushes away that helping hand, and presumably Hagar dies. So it raises this question, well, if Hagar is dead, who wrote the book? And we also see this interplay in the structure of the book, where there is memory which is recorded in a lucid narrative written by a woman who is accused by everybody else of a wandering mind. And I find this kind of play with the vocabulary, with the sentence structures, with the innovations in the language that Lawrence attempts rather fascinating. But let me enlarge this to certain other significant aspects of Canadian literature. The link, as you mentioned earlier, between nature and the early settlers in Canada. For instance, I have in mind the literary lineage of Susanna Moodie and Margaret Atwood, with Margaret Lawrence writing at about the same time. There is a kind of anxiety of influence on one hand if one is looking at literature. On the other hand, there is a great deal of sympathy for the four mother literary figures who first came to the country. How would you perceive this kind of a literary construction of the women writers in the Canadian tradition?
Well, I think the women writers really have come into their own. But as you say, Susanna Moodie is sort of an archetypal figure at the head of Canadian literature, the whole tradition, isn't she? Because she is one who came disliking the land. But then as she recorded the landscape in her own language, what happened is a change in her emotion to realize that this is where she belongs. Now, I'm going away from your, I think, linguistic aspects that you want to talk about, but this is what really fascinates me, the emotional landscape which changes as Susanna Moodie becomes part of the Canadian landscape.
Well, in a way, what you so beautifully call the emotional landscape has a vital link with language, because when I look at Margaret Atwood's journals of Susanna Moodie, they are not a pure reconstruction. There is a lot of emotion in it, a literary emotion, if one wants to call it that way. What would you say about that quality of writing of the women writers of the Anglo-Canadian tradition?
The way they use language?
Yes.
Well, for one thing, in her later novels, it's much freer, it's much more fluid, Margaret Lawrence's language. Remember, The Stone Angel was her first novel, so she was not, as I see it, experimenting too much with the technique as such. Even her narrative is fairly linear. You know, she does not go back and forth as she does in her later novels. Hagar Shipley starts at, she looks over her entire 90 years, even though the present comes in from time to time. So I think in the first novel she does stick to the traditional form a little more than she does in her later novels.
I would agree. But it's a wonderful novel to read. And as we have discussed in the last half an hour or so, there are several important features of Canadian literature that we should look for. One is the link with nature. The other is the literary influence of one writer over another. We must also look at the quality of postmodernism that is so visible in a new community. And we could perhaps address ourselves to the beginnings of the question on linguistic innovation. In our next session, Dr. Uma Parmeswaran, I think we will be happy to focus on the wonderful linguistic experiments that have been tried by the South Asian Canadians in the new nation and a new literature. And there perhaps we will have the occasion to look at different forms, not just fiction, but also poetry and drama. Thank you very much.
Thank you. It has been a pleasure.